Hello, sirs. Just an update. I have a little bit of a hacking cough, so if I start coughing in the middle of this and my lung falls out, just know that I'm okay. I'll put it back. See, there we go. I'm going to try my best to get through this as quick as possible, so you don't have to see that. Reading through the passages on spiritual adultery in Ezekiel and Hosea, identify the similarities and differences between humans committing adultery and people being unfaithful to God. First and foremost, the covenant relationship that we see between man and woman and God and Israel, from what we've read through the text and our lecture this week, is one of unity and exclusivity. It is supposed to be a union and a commitment to one another, and that is where we get this idea of adultery as unfaithfulness within that relationship. So the differences, or the similarities and differences between humans committing adultery and people being unfaithful to God. Obviously we see in Ezekiel and Hosea examples of Israel being unfaithful to God within the context of that covenant, and it is best explained or best compared within a marriage covenant because again it is Israel is breaking the covenant in the sense that they are, excuse my French, but they're whoring themselves to idols and to other desires. Israel themselves are moving away from God and breaking that unity between them and the Lord. So the similarities obviously are quite apparent, that especially in Hosea, God basically has Hosea illustrate this with his own life, marrying Gomer, marrying a known whore who was unfaithful. To make a point, to show his love, first of all, that he first of all is choosing Israel anyway, right? But that's kind of the dynamic between humans committing adultery and then people being unfaithful to God. Is when humans commit adultery, especially within the covenantal confines of marriage, it is constituted by unfaithfulness and the drawing from desire, as Dr. Hanley mentioned in our lecture this week. And that's the same thing Israel did. They see God, they're in the relationship with Him, but then they see all these other idols and all these flashy things, right? And they begin to whore around. But some differences, though. Mainly the difference that I see between the humans committing adultery and people being unfaithful to God is that, first of all, to set this up, in Ezekiel 16, it kind of shared that the adultery was happening between people that were already in the covenant, which obviously is what we've talked about. But it said that Ezekiel had mentioned that individuals or Israel was bringing the gold that the Lord gave them to contribute to idols. They were using the facilities that they had for Him for other idols. The difference, though, here is for adultery with humans, and from what we've seen, adultery from humans can happen even outside of the covenantal agreement of marriage. Now, it affects the covenantal agreement of marriage, obviously, because it will mess that up for the future or have lasting impact. We know that. And once you're an adulterer, you become an adulterer. Obviously, now we have this thing called grace and forgiveness. But thankfully, we're there. But adultery can happen outside of the confines of marriage for humans, because obviously, two unmarried people can have intercourse and they have committed adultery, right? Or one can be married, one not, and obviously those are the examples that we have. But specifically with being faithful to God, while you are in that relationship with Him, you are breaking that covenant with God the same way that Israel did. So that, I think, is like humans have more ways to illustrate or to bring about adultery. But the way that we see it written in Ezekiel and Hosea is the marriage covenant has been made, and the example is they are leaving. And we see that obviously because they agreed to the covenant. They said that we will follow your commands, right? And God said, I will be your God, and they will be my people. And they said, we'll be your people. And obviously, they didn't do it throughout the entire book of the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament, right? Which is why we have an Old Testament. But those are the similarities and differences. Why is the metaphor particularly appropriate? It definitely shows the mindset of Israel, I think it compounds and illustrates God's character a little bit too, because he is a jealous God, as what we've learned in this course. He says you won't have any other images, for he is a jealous God, right? And obviously when Israel or his people start to become unfaithful, he becomes jealous, right? And that I think those two commandments kind of coincide a little bit, because those are the images that are used in Ezekiel to illustrate that to us. So I think that's why it's proper metaphor, and it's proper metaphor because it very well illustrates the folly of straying away from the Lord and being unfaithful to Him, and it shows I'm trying to think of the word. I guess the severity, for lack of a better term, of breaking that covenantal agreement. How does the metaphor apply to the church today? Looking in the Old Testament, we know, or in the New Testament rather, we know that the church is the bride of Christ. That's the image that we've seen, and it has been, and that hasn't changed since the Old Testament. It's shifted forms, but we see the same concept with the church and with Christ. So this metaphor and this illustration still shows us today what it looks like for us to commit adultery against the Lord and commit adultery against one another and against our own bodies, right? So we definitely see that today, and in the church is the bride of Christ, and we now have a relationship with Christ individually as well, and we still can succumb to idolatry and adultery within the same confines, right? Excuse me. But anyway, so I think that's enough from me. My question, one of the things that Dr. Hanley had mentioned in his lecture was that, let's see, what was it? One more time. I had it right there. The test to figure out if somebody was, if one's wife was unfaithful or not, having to drink the dusty water. Matt, if you haven't watched the video yet, please go watch it real quick, because you probably don't know what I'm talking about. I'm sure you've watched it, but anyway, that video, basically, if they drank the dust water and they had and they believed that if they had been unfaithful to the husband, they would become sick and become infertile. If they drank the dust water and they were completely healed and they were fine, they obviously weren't. Dr. Hanley explained this as them giving it to God, them relying on the Lord for truth. And I understand that to an extent. But to me, I've always struggled with the line between trusting in that kind of sense and testing. So, obviously I try to stay away from, Lord, if you want me to do this, let it be sunny tomorrow, right? Like, just give me this sign, right? Like, I think that I've always had a hard time trying to find the line between relying and testing. And to me, that kind of sounds like testing the Lord, because you're basically just presenting a test and daring him to act, right? I don't think that's reliance. I think, to me, that's not reliance. That's more testing. That's putting him to the test. And kind of holding him hostage in a way of saying, well, I guess if you didn't act, then I guess this is your will, right? Like that's just, you're putting that, to me, that's how I see it. So my question to you and Dr. Hanley, please, if you're watching this, I would love to hear your thoughts too. What do you all think of that? What do you think is the difference between relying on the Lord in this sense with the test, or testing the Lord? But thank you guys. I know that, wow, that was 10 minutes. I really apologize.